I went ahead and downloaded the Metaphor ReFantazio demo. Uh, this was a demo put out by Atlus. It's free on, I think, most of the storefronts and stuff. So you, like, if you have Xbox, PlayStation, you can download this and give it a try yourself. This Metaphor ReFantazio, for those who aren't familiar, is a new IP from the Studio Zero, who work on the Persona games,
Yep.
of which I have only played Persona 5 and Persona 5 Strikers. So I'm a relative newbie when it comes to this series. But this demo, it's like I said, it's a new IP. Persona kind of takes place in the modern day, usually with high school students and typical kind of anime plot of fighting demons and all that sort of thing.
Right.
Um, Metaphor is a bit of a departure in that it's more of a fantasy setting. So instead of high schoolers dealing with mean old adults, you're looking at still kind of young adults, but wielding swords and magic instead.
Which makes them better.
Yeah. Well, it's also kind of weird because you do that in Persona, but thematically, castles, dragons, that
Sure,
sort of
right.
mindset versus modern day, Japan. Um, yeah, this demo is beefy.
Yeah, that was actually going to be my first question. How long is this demo?
Would you like to venture a guess as to how long I played the demo for?
I think a meaty demo, okay, is 3 hours. Like, I think if it's a 3 hour demo, I'm like, okay, you've given me a taste of this, like a chunk of your game.
Sri, this demo, they describe multiple times with voiceover in the demo that this is just the prologue.
Oh, okay.
This demo, my save time was 7 hours when I finished
Jeez,
it.
dude. Oh man. So okay.
So
But you're playing through the entire prologue in this? Is that
basically, so whenever you
okay.
install the demo, it has a little bit of text up front saying that it's the prologue of the game. And it's basically, to my knowledge, just it starts you at the beginning of the game and you're playing through up to a certain point. And then they do have functionality where you can transfer your save file from the
Okay.
demo to the full
Yeah.
game if you get it. So I believe pretty much what I played. It said there was a disclaimer that said, things might not be exactly final in the demo, so some things might switch around. But it, by and large, was just the beginning of the game that you get to play through in the demo.
Sure.
So over the last couple nights, I've been chipping away at it, and it's pretty cool. It definitely has DNA of at least Persona 5 in things like how the world is constructed and how the gameplay kind of feels, but it has different tweaks and different improvements that make the gameplay, it's different but very familiar feeling, right? This is like an Elder Scrolls and Fallout kind of situation,
Right. Yeah.
stuff like that. So to give basically a primer, I guess, because Sri, are you at all familiar with Persona and how it's played?
I mean, from my I played like a little bit of whatever Persona was on the PSP or PS Vita or one of those.
Mm-hmm.
But either way, from my understanding, you play as a college or a high school kid, and then part time you're like a superhero or something. Something's going on, but it's turn based combat, and it's kind of like a dungeon crawler. Not dungeon crawler, I'd say, but like something with dungeons. I think there's dungeons in there. The word dungeon pops out, but
Mm-hmm.
that's about all I know. Oh, and Joker. I think Joker is also something I know.
Yeah, Joker's the main character from Persona 5.
I pretty much played the game.
Yeah, I actually wanted to mention because Persona 5, whenever I finished that game, it was over 100 hours when I hit
Yeah.
credits. And so if the prologue is 7 hours, definitely gear up for another long game. Those of you that are, thinking of hopping into Metaphor here. But yeah, you basically summed up a very broad stroke of the gameplay. It's turn-based combat. It's I'm only going to use Pokemon because it's like an easy kind of point of comparison where
This just in:
enemies
Metaphor
enemies
ReFantazio is like Pokemon. That's the title.
yep. Um enemies are kind of like they have strengths and weaknesses like Pokemon have. So like say there's like, a weird grass looking knight. It's not quite that simple, but just to paint a picture, if you use a fire attack, you're going to do, increased damage and other things that I'll get into. If you use like a grass attack or something, it'll do not as much damage. So enemies have strengths and weaknesses. Um, the way that it differs here is in a couple of different ways. The turns themselves are made up of actions. And this kind of worked this way in Persona 5, and I believe in some of the other ones, where each person in your party basically gets an action that they get to do on the team. And that comprises your turn, more or less.
Right.
And actions can be a number of different things. So you can use like your melee weapon, you could use a magic spell, you could choose to guard, which means that you don't attack, but you'll take less damage if you're attacked, like in the next turn. And there's other things that I'll get into, but like using an item costs an action. There are ways to augment your actions, and this is kind of like in Persona 5, basically, you could sneak up on enemies, and as long as you got the drop on them, you would get like an advantage. So, first of all, you would start first, but you would also, be able to start setting up different things, in your turn to basically give it so like you get 2 turns at the start, if that makes sense. In Metaphor, they've introduced like some very light action elements to the mix. Because in Persona, it was just kind of like, sneak up, hit the button once you're in range, and then you're going into the turn-based combat. In this, you get to actually like swing your weapon around outside of combat. And if you go up to enemies and kind of like start hitting them and comboing them, you'll build up a stun gauge. And once the stun gauge is built, if you then go into turn-based combat, the enemies are all going to be stunned for a full turn. So that automatically gives you 2 turns at the start where basically you don't have to worry about anything coming your way.
Right.
Which I think it's a small thing, but I think it makes it a lot more fun. Just like exploring the world instead of like constantly being like, okay, like turn-based, okay, out of turn-based, turn-based, out of turn-based, turn-based, out of turn-based. Like now it's just like a little bit more dynamic, and
Sure.
it gives you like a fun bonus right at the start.
Right.
One thing that I really like is that Persona in this game, they use like a tiered enemy system, and it's usually color-coded where it's like low-level enemies are blue, mid-level enemies are yellow, and like really tough enemies are red. Any blue enemies that are out in the world, if you just start attacking them, it won't even go into turn-based combat. It'll just kill the enemies and you'll get experience.
Oh, that's pretty. A little bit cuts out some of that dead air almost.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's, old games like Earthbound and stuff, like once you hit a certain level, just random encounters would just auto-complete themselves. So it's always nice to see that where it's like, if you seriously are just going to like waste your time against these enemies, like we'll just bypass a little bit of that. So I was a big fan of that. I started this talking about how enemies have weaknesses, and if you are able to exploit an enemy's weakness, it basically gives you a turn action back. So you can't like infinitely have your turn last forever, but essentially you'll get like an extra turn action that, the next person in your party can use if you're chaining together exploiting weaknesses for all the enemies.
Gotcha.
So what this basically leads to with the combat is exploiting weaknesses, getting a bunch of bonuses, and then if you take out all of the enemies without taking a hit, basically you get extra rewards for beating that battle. It comes up on the screen as unscathed triumph, which is like really epic. But yeah, basically like you'll get a bunch of bonus stuff if you can do it without getting hit. Now these games can be a little bit challenging at times, so you're not always just going to be able to like, curb stomp a group of enemies.
Sure.
There was even some fights in the demo, like I was just playing on normal and, I got pretty close to team wiping if I wasn't being careful. So um there's a lot of things that, help out your combat in that way, but kind of like Persona, there's also a lot of weaknesses that your own team has and other things that the enemies can do that will always keep you on your toes. So for instance, I was describing how you can attack the enemies to build up the stun gauge before you go into turn-based combat.
Uh-huh.
If you are attacked before you're able to stun them, then basically the inverse happens where the enemy gets to go first, and that can be really devastating. Like right at the top, if they have like a certain
That would
lineup
suck.
or like buffing their party right on turn one, that's pretty tough. One thing that I learned about earlier today when I was playing is party members on your team can be inflicted with anxiety, which I don't think this has been in any of the other games that I've seen. But anxiety basically causes enemy attacks to not cost any turn actions, and your person that has anxiety can't use their archetype, which is kind of like their persona in this game, which is like,
I
a
see.
super powered thing. So like if anybody gets inflicted with anxiety, like it's pretty brutal for the punishment. That like your team has to, work around now.
Yeah.
So
How do you get rid of anxiety? Other than like
there's
smoking weed or something, I know.
Yeah, there's like consumable items or like, just,
Okay.
waiting a couple turns, it'll
Gotcha,
go away.
okay.
But yeah, let me see. I have some notes here, so I just want to make sure that I'm getting everything.
I mean, look, 7 hours is such a meaty chunk of game. I know for a game like this, it's not even like you're barely scratching the surface, but I feel you could probably get we're going to talk about it later, but like Starfield, that's almost the size of the DLC that we're that we're playing. So,
the other thing that I found interesting about the combat, I'm talking a lot about combat up front, but there is a little bit extra to this demo. As far as differences with Persona, there is a lane system in this game, which I can't really think of any RPGs off my head that I've seen this in. I'm sure that it has existed in others, but basically there's a front lane and a back lane, and you can move your characters between both lanes. If they're in the front lane, they will deal more damage with melee attacks, but they'll also take more damage. And if they're in the back lane, it's like the inverse. They'll take less damage, but they won't deal as much.
Oh, I see.
And that also played into the combat in a really interesting way. I guess I'll just kind of walk through like an example just to like paint a picture. So, for instance, I, stunned a group of enemies, went into combat. Two of my melee weapons were weaknesses to the enemies that were in front of me. So basically, with how my team was ordered, I was able to do one weakness attack and then a second weakness attack. And basically that meant that I had like 3 more turn actions that I could do. So my third character, she has this ability that is able to basically draw aggro. So it's like any enemies will only attack me for 1 turn.
Sure.
So basically what I could then set up was I could have her go into the back lane. I could have her cast that, and then I would still have my turn action so that I could attack again. And then whenever it was her turn for the last turn action, I could hit guard. So now she's pretty much fully protected. She'll still take a little bit of damage from attacks, but all of my guys that like are weaker to the enemies, they're scot-free while she takes all the damage, and then I can reset that again for the next turn. So there's some really interesting kind of dynamics at play with the combat, just like Persona, that make it a bit more engaging than something just like a Pokemon.
Regular turn-based. Yeah.
Where like I feel like when I play Pokemon, like it's just kind of basic and just like, trades like here and there. It's just like, okay, you're weak to this attack. Like I'll just spam that until you're done, right?
That's the strategy,
Whereas
Nick.
exactly. Whereas when I played Persona and when I'm playing this, like I am stopping and thinking at certain times when I'm like, caught with like a tough situation. It's like, okay, how am I gonna dig myself out of this? Or I'm met with like the awesome feeling of just going in, wiping the floor, and getting all these like bonuses and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Um, as is to be expected with this team now, after I'd played Persona 5 and just seeing some of their other games, the presentation and the animation is like insane. Very flashy menus, very flashy visual effects. The like transitions into battle and stuff are just so cool. Not
The
to
menus
mention
sort
the
of
like,
remind me of Persona. I feel like they still have some of that Persona flair.
yeah, this one is definitely more like it's like paint is what like the main theme is of a lot of the visual like UI elements. Like Persona kind of has that, but it felt more like, comic booky like pop art when I played
Sure.
Persona 5. This is definitely more like brush strokes, like the skybox just looks like hand painted, which
Mm.
is like a really cool look. Um but yeah, just visually speaking, it's awesome. The music was really weird at first to me, but it's since really grown on me. It's like very epic fantasy, but then it also just has like this guy chanting during the battle where it's just like like it sounds really weird the first couple times, but then it's just like, oh shit, this is pretty hype like when you get into the fight. So I really like that. Um and is there anything else that I really wanted to talk about? Uh oh, yes. So maybe to be expected by people that have played Persona, if you haven't, uh the game has a very lengthy opening where you're not really doing a whole lot.
Wow.
Um
Yeah.
it's it's a lot of dialogue. Persona 5 obviously was like filled with dialogue. It's a lot of talking. So
That's
if
all
that
actually.
kind of puts you
That's another
off,
thing I remember from whatever Persona I played. I think it was Persona 3 Golden or something. Is that one of them?
4 golden was
4
the Vita
Golden? What's
one.
the third one? Royale? No, is it 5
Um,
Royale? Whatever that one is.
yes, 5 is royal.
But either way, I also remember lengthy dialogue sequences, just a lot of dialogue.
Hmm. And they like it's a new IP. They have to set things up, but yeah,
Sure.
it definitely takes its time to get going with the game. Like the first night that I played it, like I barely did any combat, and I played for like an hour and a half. So it was yes, it's definitely a very lengthy cutscene kind of heavy opening, but at the same time, the cutscenes kind of like Persona are anime style. They're really high quality, really nice like vocal performances and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So it's definitely seems like it's going to be another heavy hitting RPG from the studio, and it's got me interested in it. For me personally, I really like the heist kind of genre, and so things about Persona 5 that are more directly messing with those kind of themes, I found myself like it really got its hooks into me. I wasn't expecting to
Right.
like that game as much as I did.
Yeah. I mean, you
And
kind of had to go through 100 something hours into it.
exactly. Metaphor, the gameplay, I'm really liking a lot of the changes from Persona that the game is playing with, but I'm not quite as big of a fan of the overall theme. That's not to say it's not like it's, bad or anything. Like I think it's really cool and it's definitely unique. Um it's just it's not quite my cup of tea, so it's like I don't think I'm going to like rush out and play this game,
Sure.
but it's definitely an interesting game, and I I think the hype that is surrounding it is probably, well justified. It seems like it's going to be a pretty sweet game.